Puer delicatus, which translates poorly into our language. Delicate boy captures none of the weight, none of the specific social position, none of the elaborate legal and cultural framework that surrounded these young men. Some modern historians prefer concubinus, though even this fails to convey what life actually meant for boys and young men trapped in this particular form of slavery. We know their stories primarily through the complaints of moralists like Seneca the Younger, through legal codes that regulated their sale and use, through poetry that celebrated or mocked them, and through the occasional gravestone that hints at affection, genuine or performed. Marcus Virius Flaccus, the imperial tutor under Augustus, once wrote that distinguishing between different categories of slaves required understanding subtle gradations of degradation. An agricultural slave might break his back in the fields, but a pure delicatus faced a different breaking entirely. Physical beauty determined survival, yet that same beauty guaranteed exploitation. Youth was currency, but aging meant obsolescence. Education and refinement were required, but expressing genuine intelligence could be dangerous. Consider Sparus, perhaps the most famous of these concubines, though his story represents an extreme rather than the norm. Suetonius tells us that Emperor Nero, after kicking his pregnant wife Poppaea to death in 65 AD, noticed that young Sparus bore a striking resemblance to her. What followed defies modern comprehension, yet was documented by multiple Roman historians as fact, not scandal. Nero had the boy castrated, though castration itself was illegal under Roman law since the reign of Domitian. Emperors existed above such restrictions. He dressed Sparus in the empress's clothes, placed him in her apartments, and went through a marriage ceremony complete with dowry and wedding hymns. Romans in the Forum were required to address this teenage boy as Empress and Augusta. But Sporus's ordeal didn't end with Nero's suicide in 68 AD. Nymphidius Sabinus, the Praetorian prefect, immediately claimed him. Then Emperor Otho took possession, keeping Sporus as his companion during his brief reign. When Vitellius seized power, he planned to have Sporus reenact the rape of Proserpina in the arena, a death sentence disguised as entertainment. Rather than face this final humiliation, Sporus took his own life. He was perhaps 21 years old. Most concubines didn't suffer such theatrical cruelty, but their daily reality contained its own catalogue of normalized horror. Purchase often occurred between ages 7 and 14, with buyers examining boys like livestock, checking teeth, muscle tone, skin quality, testing flexibility of limbs. Syrian and Greek boys commanded the highest prices, especially those with what Romans considered ideal features: large eyes, full lips, soft skin, and graceful movements. Slave dealers would pluck body hair, apply cosmetics, teach specific walks and gestures that suggested availability, while maintaining an air of reluctant innocence. Once purchased, a boy entered a household where his position was simultaneously privileged and precarious. He might wear silk while house slaves wore rough tunics, eat delicacies while others received barley, sleep near his master while others huddled in cellars. Yet this elevation came with absolute availability. Martial, writing in the 1st century AD, describes dinner parties where concubines were passed between guests like wine cups. Petronius in his Satyricon depicts boys standing nude beside dining couches for hours, holding perfume and towels, available for any guest's whim. Training began immediately upon purchase. Dancing, singing, and playing instruments were standard requirements. Greek and Latin literature, particularly poetry, had to be memorized for recitation. Conversation skills were essential, knowing when to speak wittily, when to remain silent, how to laugh at appropriate moments. Many received extensive education in mathematics, philosophy, and rhetoric, not for their own enrichment, but to provide intellectual companionship. Plutarch mentions a concubine who could discuss Stoic philosophy while pouring wine, though he notes this as an unusual extravagance rather than the norm. Physical maintenance consumed hours daily. Hair was styled elaborately, often in fashions that contemporary Romans considered effeminate on free males but appropriate for concubines. Pumice stones removed body hair. Cosmetics, white lead for pale skin, antimony for lined eyes, vermilion for lips were applied each morning. Perfumes, imported at enormous expense from Arabia and India, marked them as luxury objects. Some masters insisted on specific diets to maintain slim figures. Others force-fed boys to achieve a plumpness associated with prosperity. Medical texts from physicians like Soranus of Ephesus reveal disturbing practices aimed at preserving youthful appearance. Bloodletting was believed to maintain soft skin. Certain herbs supposedly delayed the growth of body hair and deepening of voice. Some boys had their pubic hair permanently removed through repeated plucking or caustic depilatories containing quicklime. When inevitable physical maturation occurred despite these efforts, the consequences varied. Lucky ones might transition to other household roles: secretary, accountant, tutor to younger slaves. Many were simply sold to brothels or mines, their market value exhausted. Legal protections were essentially non-existent. While Roman law theoretically prohibited the castration of slaves within Roman territory, after Domitian's edict in 83 AD, buyers simply purchased pre-castrated boys from beyond the borders. Technically, forcing a slave into prostitution who was sold with a niece of a prostituta clause was illegal, but proving such violations was nearly impossible. A master possessed absolute sexual access to his slaves regardless of age or consent, concepts that didn't exist in Roman legal framework concerning slaves. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect was how Roman society normalized and even celebrated these arrangements. Poets like Catullus and Tibullus wrote tender verses to their delicatae. Statius composed an elaborate consolation poem for Flavius Ursus when his young concubine Philetos died, comparing the boy to Ganymede and suggesting the gods had reclaimed their own. These literary works present affection, even love, but always within the framework of absolute ownership. A master might genuinely mourn a dead concubine while simultaneously shopping for a replacement. Public visibility formed part of their function. During banquets, concubines served as living decorations, standing behind couches, fanning guests, offering silver finger bowls between courses. Their presence demonstrated wealth. Maintaining a beautiful, educated concubine required enormous ongoing expense. They accompanied masters to the baths, carrying oil flasks and strigils, waiting nude in the caldarium while their owners soaked. At the theatre, they sat at their masters' feet rather than in seats, visible to all as possessions. Religious festivals provided no respite. During Saturnalia, when traditional roles supposedly inverted and slaves enjoyed temporary freedom, concubines often faced increased demands as masters hosted elaborate parties. The Floralia, celebrating Flora, goddess of flowers and youthful beauty, featured nude performances where concubines might be compelled to dance publicly. Even funeral rites could involve them. Some wills specified that favorite concubines should be sacrificed on their master's pyre, though this practice was officially banned by the Senate in 11 AD. Economy intersected with exploitation in complex ways. Successful concubines might accumulate substantial peculium, property technically owned by the master but controlled by the slave. Graceful manipulation of multiple admirers could yield gifts of gold, jewelry, even land rights. Some masters permitted their concubines to own their own slaves, creating hierarchies within hierarchies. Occasionally, a particularly favored concubine might purchase his own freedom, though manumission papers often included clauses requiring continued sexual availability. Documentation suggests that suicide rates among concubines far exceeded those of other slave categories. Seneca mentions matter-of-factly that wise masters restricted access to rope and sharp objects. Poison was a constant concern, not just that concubines might kill themselves, but that they might kill masters who had exhausted them. The Emperor Claudius's concubine Helotus was rumored to have administered the poisoned mushrooms that killed him, though acting on Agrippina's orders rather than his own initiative. Disease spread rapidly through this demographic. Galen, physician to Marcus Aurelius, described treating concubines for what modern medicine would recognize as sexually transmitted infections, though he attributed them to excessive humidity of temperament rather than understanding transmission. Anal fissures, rectal prolapse, and chronic pain were common enough that medical texts included specific treatments aimed at this population. Depression and anxiety, described as melancholic disposition and nervous exhaustion, were endemic. Violence permeated their existence beyond just sexual assault. Masters might beat concubines for minor infractions, spilling wine, speaking out of turn, showing insufficient enthusiasm. Jealous wives and legitimate children often targeted them for particular cruelty. Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius, reportedly had several of her husband's favorites executed on fabricated charges. Even other slaves might abuse them, resentful of their privileged position while safe in the knowledge that a concubine who fought back would be punished severely. Some found protection through strategic alliances. Becoming the favorite of a powerful master offered relative security. Emperor Hadrian's relationship with Antinous, while exceptional in its public prominence, demonstrates how affection could provide temporary shelter. Antinous accompanied Hadrian on imperial tours, received honors typically reserved for family members, and was deified after drowning in the Nile in 13 AD. Yet even this extraordinary favoritism couldn't prevent persistent rumors that Antinous had been murdered or forced to sacrifice himself for Hadrian's health through some mystical ritual. Children resulted from these arrangements more often than popular history suggests. Roman masters regularly used both male and female slaves sexually, and pregnancy among female slaves was common. Male concubines who hadn't been castrated might father children with female slaves, creating complex family structures within servitude. These children were born slaves, their futures determined by their perceived beauty and usefulness. Attractive children might be groomed from birth to follow their parents into concubinage. Education, when genuine rather than decorative, occasionally provided escape routes. A concubine who demonstrated exceptional literary talent might become a secretary or librarian. Mathematical ability could lead to accounting positions. Several Roman writers began life as educated slaves, though they rarely discussed their early experiences. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, was likely used sexually in his youth. His writings contain veiled references to enduring degradation with philosophical detachment. Regional variations existed across the empire. In Greece, with its historical tradition of pederasty, Roman practices merged with local customs, creating distinctive patterns. Egyptian concubines often came from indigenous priestly families who sold children to Roman administrators. In Gaul and Germania, captured warriors' sons were particularly prized for their perceived combination of barbarian vigor and youthful beauty. British slaves, after Claudius's conquest in 43 AD, were initially considered too crude for concubinage, but gradually entered the market as Roman culture spread northward. Market forces shaped lives in predictable patterns. Wars produced surges of enslaved children, dropping prices temporarily. Economic downturns meant masters might rent out concubines to associates or brothels for additional income. During the crisis of the 3rd century, when Roman currency collapsed, concubines became literal currency, traded for goods, used to settle debts, gambled away in dice games. Tax records from Egypt show assessors evaluating concubines alongside livestock and agricultural equipment. Architecture reflected their presence. Wealthy villas included specific chambers for housing concubines, close enough for convenient access, but separated from family quarters. Wall paintings from Pompeii and Herculaneum show idealized scenes of boys serving wine, playing flutes, reclining on couches in poses suggesting availability. These images, preserved by volcanic ash, provide visual evidence of how Romans wanted to see these relationships: beautiful, cultured, and completely sanitized of their violent reality. Literary evidence requires careful interpretation. Roman authors wrote for audiences that considered slavery natural and sexual use of slaves unremarkable. When Pliny the Younger praises a friend for the moderation of keeping only 3 concubines, he reveals normalized excess. Juvenal's satires mock masters who fall in love with their pueri, not because the relationship involves children, but because emotional attachment to property seemed ridiculous. These texts provide information through their assumptions rather than their arguments. Medical texts offer clinical glimpses into physical suffering. Celsus describes treating tears and injuries with wine and olive oil. Surgical procedures to restore stretched orifices appear in multiple texts, suggesting demand for such operations. Instructions for maintaining tightness through astringent suppositories reveal expectations of continued use despite damage. Pain management consisted primarily of wine and poppy preparations, creating dependencies that masters could exploit for control. Legal codes evolved slowly and ineffectively. Constantine's laws in the 4th century AD prohibited the prostitution of children, but exempted those already enslaved. Justinian's 6th century codes finally banned the sexual use of child slaves, but enforcement remained sporadic at best. Christian influence gradually shifted public discourse around sexuality, but private practice changed slowly. Church fathers like Augustine wrote about the sin of keeping concubines while acknowledging their own participation in such arrangements before conversion. Economic records from Egyptian papyri show concubines being mortgaged, inherited, and divided among heirs. One document from Oxyrhynchus describes 3 brothers sharing ownership of a Syrian boy on rotating months. Another records a lawsuit over damage to a rented concubine, with the renter arguing that pre-existing conditions reduced his liability. These mundane financial documents strip away any romantic veneer, revealing pure commodification of human beings. Names, when recorded, tell stories. Many concubines received Greek names regardless of origin: Ganymede, Hyacinth, Narcissus, marking them as sexual objects through mythological reference. Others got diminutive Latin names: Dulcitus, sweetness; Delicatus, delicate; Tenor, tender, that emphasized youth and vulnerability. Some emperors renamed favorites entirely, erasing previous identity. The absence of names in many records reveals how thoroughly personhood could be erased. Resistance took subtle forms. Feigned illness might provide temporary reprieve. Deliberately gaining weight or scarring skin could reduce market value. Though punishment for such defiance was severe, some learned to manipulate masters psychologically, playing on emotions to gain advantages. Others formed secret relationships with fellow slaves, creating emotional bonds that provided psychological survival even when physical escape remained impossible. Manumission, when it occurred, rarely meant freedom from sexual obligation. Roman law recognized various forms of freedom, and freed concubines often received conditional liberty, requiring continued service. The social stigma of having been a concubine followed freedmen throughout life. Marriage to freeborn citizens was legally possible but socially difficult. Many freedmen concubines ended up in similar relationships with new patrons, trapped in cycles of exploitation despite technical freedom. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii provides frozen moments. A brothel's upper room contained a child's toy alongside explicit wall paintings. Small sleeping chambers barely large enough for a mat show where concubines lived. Graffiti scratched into walls includes what might be names, dates, or counting marks. Ambiguous records of endurance. Skeletal remains of young males show evidence of chronic stress, malnutrition despite access to rich food, and injuries consistent with regular assault. Personal belongings, when found, are heartbreaking in their ordinariness. A bronze mirror, a bone hairpin, a small clay figure, objects that suggest humanity persisting despite dehumanization. Letter fragments on papyrus occasionally surface, though determining whether they were written by or about concubines proves difficult. One possible example from Vindolanda in Britain contains what might be a concubine writing to his mother, though the fragmentary text allows multiple interpretations. Religious practices among concubines remain largely undocumented. Some evidence suggests devotion to Eastern mystery cults, Cybele, Mithras, Isis, that promised salvation or transformation. Christianity's appeal to slaves included its theoretical rejection of sexual exploitation, though Christian masters often continued traditional practices. Funerary inscriptions occasionally mention concubines, though usually in formulaic phrases that reveal little about lived experience. By the 4th century AD, social changes were slowly emerging. Christian emperors issued increasingly restrictive laws about slavery and sexuality, though enforcement remained inconsistent. Economic factors, the expense of maintaining urban slave households, the growth of rural agricultural systems, changing military structures gradually reduced demand for concubines. The barbarian invasions brought different cultural attitudes toward sexuality and slavery, though exploitation certainly continued in evolved forms. Modern archaeology continues uncovering evidence. Bioarchaeology examines skeletal remains for signs of stress, disease, and trauma. Chemical analysis of bones reveals dietary information, geographic origins, and sometimes cause of death. DNA analysis has begun identifying family relationships among buried slaves, revealing complex kinship networks within servitude. Each technical advance provides new windows into experiences Romans considered too mundane to document. Comparative history shows similar patterns across cultures: Ottoman Kuchek dancers, Chinese opera performers in imperial courts, various forms of sexual slavery throughout human civilization. The specific Roman practice existed within broader patterns of exploitation. Understanding these connections doesn't minimize Roman-specific horrors, but contextualizes them within persistent human capacity for systematized cruelty. Contemporary relevance remains uncomfortable but necessary to acknowledge. Human trafficking, particularly of children for sexual exploitation, continues globally. Modern slaves might not be called concubines, but the fundamental dynamics, economic desperation, legal vulnerability, social normalization of exploitation, persist in evolved forms. Historical distance makes Roman practices seem safely remote, but their underlying structures remain present in contemporary societies that prefer not to see them. Scholarly debate continues about interpretation and emphasis. Some historians stress agency and resistance, finding evidence of concubines who manipulated systems to their advantage. Others emphasize structural violence, arguing that focusing on exceptional cases minimizes systematic oppression. These academic arguments matter because they shape how we understand both past and present forms of exploitation. Translation issues complicate understanding. Latin and Greek terms carry connotations lost in English. Legal language that seems precise often contained deliberate ambiguities, allowing flexible interpretation. Euphemisms obscure violent realities. Delicate meant rapeable. Companionship meant sexual slavery. Education meant grooming. Modern translators must balance accuracy with clarity, deciding how explicitly to render what Romans expressed obliquely. Source reliability requires constant evaluation. Elite Roman authors wrote from perspectives that normalized their own behavior. Christian authors condemning pagan practices often revealed more about contemporary Christian anxieties than historical reality. Archaeological evidence provides crucial correctives, but requires careful interpretation. Absence of evidence, the silence of victims themselves, speaks volumes about whose voices societies preserve. Gender dynamics within concubinage were complex. While this account focuses on male concubines, female sexual slaves faced parallel and intersecting oppressions. Some female slaves were forced into relationships with male concubines to produce attractive children. Competition between different categories of slaves for relative privilege created divisions that benefited masters. Understanding these intersections reveals how systems of oppression function through manufactured hierarchies among the oppressed. Class intersected with slavery in complicated ways. Freeborn Romans who fell into debt slavery might become concubines. Abandoned children raised as slaves despite freeborn parents entered concubinage without ever experiencing freedom. Pirates captured travelers and sold them into slavery regardless of original status. These variations in origin created different experiences and possibilities within the same brutal system. Provincial perspectives differed from metropolitan Rome. Frontier regions might have fewer available slaves, making concubines rarer and more valuable. Local traditions merged with Roman practices, creating regional variations. Distance from Roman legal authority might allow practices officially banned in Rome itself. Understanding empire-wide patterns requires acknowledging these regional differences, while recognizing underlying commonalities. Technology and concubinage intersected in unexpected ways. Glass-making advances produced mirrors that allowed new forms of grooming and display. Imported silk from China created new possibilities for costume and presentation. Developments in perfume production, cosmetics, and hair treatments all shaped concubine culture. These technological aspects reveal how exploitation incorporated contemporary innovations. Economic analysis reveals stunning costs. Maintaining a single high-status concubine might cost more annually than employing dozens of agricultural slaves. This extreme expense made concubines powerful status symbols. Economic downturns forced mass sales, flooding markets and dropping prices temporarily. Understanding these economic dimensions helps explain both the persistence and eventual decline of the practice. Environmental factors played roles rarely considered. Lead in cosmetics and water pipes may have caused chronic poisoning among concubines who used products extensively. Nutritional deficiencies from restricted diets caused various health problems. Urban pollution in Rome itself, from industries, cooking fires, and human waste, created health challenges that affected slaves disproportionately. These environmental aspects added layers to already brutal conditions. Seasonal patterns shaped experiences. Summer heat made elaborate clothing and cosmetics torturous. Winter cold in poorly heated quarters caused suffering for lightly clothed concubines required to appear decorative rather than warm. Festival seasons brought increased demands and dangers. Agricultural cycles affected food availability and quality. Understanding these rhythms reveals how natural patterns intersected with human cruelty. Language acquisition formed crucial survival skills. Concubines from various origins had to master Latin or Greek quickly. Those who could switch between languages and dialects held advantages. Ability to understand but pretend ignorance of certain conversations might provide strategic benefits. Code switching between slave quarters and masters' chambers required constant vigilance. These linguistic dimensions reveal another layer of required performance. Travel exposed concubines to particular dangers. Accompanying masters on journeys meant isolation from any potential support networks. Sea voyages brought risks of piracy and shipwreck. Military campaigns exposed them to combat dangers while being required to provide services. Provincial assignments might mean years in isolation with abusive masters. These mobile experiences differed significantly from those of stationary household slaves. Memory and trauma manifested in various ways. Some freed concubines later wrote obliquely about their experiences. Others apparently suppressed memories entirely. Psychological concepts Romans wouldn't have recognized. PTSD, dissociation, complex trauma clearly affected victims. Physical scars might fade, but psychological damage persisted. Understanding trauma's long-term effects helps grasp the full scope of harm inflicted. Intergenerational impacts extended beyond immediate victims. Children of concubines, whether fathered by them or born to them, inherited trauma and stigma. Family structures shattered by slavery created lasting wounds. Cultural practices around sexuality and power were transmitted through generations. These intergenerational effects reveal how individual exploitation created society-wide damage. Artistic representation both revealed and concealed reality. Sculptures idealized youthful beauty, while hiding violence. Mosaics depicted mythological scenes that normalized sexual predation. literature romanticized relationships that were fundamentally coercive. These artistic works provide evidence while simultaneously serving as propaganda for the system they depicted. Understanding their dual nature requires reading both surface and subtext. Death brought no dignity. Concubines who died young might receive elaborate funerals if beloved by masters, but these ceremonies centered the master's grief rather than the victim's humanity. Those who aged out of desirability often died in poverty and obscurity. Suicide victims were denied proper burial rites. Mass graves for slaves make individual identification impossible. Even in death, personhood was denied. Reform attempts, when they occurred, were limited and ineffective. Philosophical schools like Stoicism preached human dignity, while their adherents owned slaves. Legal reforms created loopholes larger than the protections they supposedly provided. Religious movements that condemned sexual exploitation often created new forms of it. Understanding these failed reforms reveals how deeply embedded the system was in Roman society. Social mobility, when it occurred, came at tremendous cost. A few exceptional individuals managed to transform from concubine to freed citizen to respected member of society. These rare cases were held up as proof the system wasn't entirely cruel, but they actually demonstrate its fundamental brutality. Survival required exceptional talent, luck, and willingness to endure years of abuse. These success stories were used to blame those who didn't escape their circumstances. Documentation gaps tell their own stories. We know names of emperors' favorites, but not the thousands who suffered in ordinary households. Legal texts describe property rights, but not human experiences. Medical texts detail physical damage, but not emotional devastation. These silences in the historical record reflect whose lives Romans considered worth recording. Understanding what's missing is as important as analyzing what survives. Cultural transmission of trauma affected entire populations. Societies that normalized sexual exploitation of children created cycles of abuse that persisted through generations. Attitudes toward power, sexuality, and human dignity were shaped by these practices. Even those who never directly participated absorbed cultural messages about domination and submission. These cultural impacts extended far beyond individual victims. International trade in human beings connected distant regions through shared horror. Celtic children captured in Gaul might end up in Syrian brothels. Greek boys might serve Roman masters in Britain. This vast network of human trafficking created economic and cultural connections built on suffering. Understanding these networks reveals how exploitation became systematically embedded in ancient globalization. Resistance networks, though largely undocumented, must have existed. Shared languages among slaves from similar origins, secret religious practices, whisper networks warning about dangerous masters. These informal support systems provided minimal protection, but psychological solidarity. Their absence from official records doesn't mean they didn't exist, only that they operated beyond Roman documentation. You might wonder how any society could normalize such systematic cruelty, but normalization is precisely the mechanism that enables atrocity. Romans didn't see themselves as cruel. They lived within a worldview that defined certain humans as property, certain bodies as available, certain suffering as natural. Each individual participation seemed small: buying a slave, attending a banquet, writing a poem. Collective participation created systematic horror that no individual felt fully responsible for perpetrating. Modern parallels remain uncomfortable but undeniable. Contemporary human trafficking, particularly for sexual exploitation, follows patterns Romans would recognize. Economic inequality that forces desperate families to sell children, legal systems that fail to protect the vulnerable, social attitudes that blame victims rather than perpetrators. Technologies change, but fundamental dynamics persist. Understanding historical atrocity means recognizing its contemporary manifestations. Archaeological work continues revealing new evidence. Each excavation might uncover artifacts that illuminate these hidden lives. Advances in scientific analysis provide new ways to interpret existing evidence. Digital humanities projects are creating databases that allow pattern recognition across scattered sources. Future discoveries will undoubtedly complicate and enrich our understanding of these historical experiences. Ethical responsibilities in discussing this history require careful balance. Sanitizing makes atrocity seem acceptable. Sensationalizing disrespects victims' suffering. Academic distance can drain human horror from human experience. Finding appropriate ways to discuss systematic sexual violence against children challenges writers, educators, and content creators. These stories must be told, but told responsibly. Educational value extends beyond historical curiosity. Understanding how societies normalize atrocity helps recognize contemporary patterns. Seeing how economic systems commodify human beings illuminates modern exploitation. Recognizing how legal systems fail to protect the vulnerable reveals ongoing injustices. Historical distance provides perspective on present cruelties we might otherwise accept as natural or inevitable. Individual stories, when they can be recovered, humanize statistics. Knowing that a boy named Alexis was purchased at age 9, educated in rhetoric, used sexually for 7 years, then sold to a brothel when his voice changed. This specificity makes abstract horror concrete. Even fragmentary personal details restore humanity that systems of exploitation attempted to erase. Scholarly responsibility requires acknowledging interpretive limits. We cannot fully understand experiences so distant from our own. Modern categories of identity, consent, and trauma don't map perfectly onto ancient experiences. Translation loses nuance. Sources reflect elite perspectives. These limitations don't invalidate historical inquiry, but require humility about what we can and cannot know about past suffering. Public history faces particular challenges discussing this topic. Museums displaying Roman artifacts rarely acknowledge the sexual slavery that supported elite culture. Popular media romanticizes Rome while ignoring its systematic brutalities. Educational curricula sanitize ancient history into safely distant narratives. Honest public history requires confronting uncomfortable truths about civilizations we're taught to admire. Commemorative possibilities remain largely unexplored. No monuments memorialize these victims. No museums center their experiences. No days of remembrance acknowledge their suffering. This absence reflects ongoing discomfort with acknowledging sexual violence, particularly against children, as central rather than peripheral to great civilizations. Creating space for commemoration would require fundamentally reconsidering how we memorialize the past. Comparative suffering across slave categories shouldn't minimize any particular horror. Agricultural slaves faced different but equally severe brutality. Gladiators died for entertainment. Mine slaves labored in conditions that guaranteed early death. Understanding concubinage, as one form among many types of Roman slavery, reveals systematic rather than exceptional cruelty. Each category of suffering deserves recognition without competition over whose oppression was worst. Temporal perspective reveals gradual change alongside persistent patterns. From republic to empire to late antiquity, specific practices evolved while underlying exploitation continued. Christianity's rise altered justifications more than practices. Economic changes shifted patterns of slavery without eliminating it. Understanding this temporal dimension prevents both romanticizing the past and assuming inevitable progress. Final reflections must acknowledge ongoing relevance. This isn't safely ancient history, but documentation of patterns that persist. Children are still sold. Bodies are still commodified. Power still exploits vulnerability. Legal systems still fail to protect those most needing protection. Understanding historical atrocity means recognizing its continuation rather than congratulating ourselves on progress. Dawn comes again to that Roman villa, as it has for 2,000 years. Sunlight still filters through windows where boys once stood in silk and chains. Marble worn by countless footsteps remains cold to the touch. Somewhere, in forms evolved but fundamentally unchanged, another child wakes to similar sounds. Metal against stone, power against vulnerability, centuries collapsing into a single moment of sustained suffering that connects ancient Rome to our contemporary world. We study history not because it's past, but because it isn't. Because every normalized atrocity we uncover in gilt-edged antiquity reveals something about the horrors we've trained ourselves not to see in our own supposedly civilized age. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes in cascading symphonies of suffering that echo across millennia. Those Roman boys whose names are mostly lost, whose voices were never recorded, whose pain was considered too mundane to document, they wake with us each morning, reminding us that civilization and atrocity have always been intimate companions, that beauty and brutality intertwine in every society that convinces itself its cruelties are natural, necessary, or normal. In the end, we don't study what was normal for Roman concubines to understand Rome. We study it to understand ourselves and the terrible human capacity to make horror mundane through the simple, devastating act of looking away.